right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Tiffany Basciano. I'm the Associate Director of the International Law and Organizations program here, and I would like to welcome everybody to SAIS. It's our pleasure once again to co-sponsor an event with WOLA, this time on Venezuela in the midst of its own political crisis. It's always nice to talk about a different one nowadays. So, although I'm sure there'll be implications, please allow me to introduce the panel's moderator, Professor David Smiley, a senior fellow at WOLA and professor of social relations at Tulane. We look forward to the discussion. So, thank you very much.
No? Okay, now we have it. Okay, thank you, Tiffany, for the collaboration of SAIS, and thank you all for turning out. This is a great turnout. I think the degree of interest that has been shown in this panel is indicative of the level of the sort of heightened uncertainty that there is about Venezuela right now. We originally conceived of this panel as a symposium as taking place in the sort of lull between the collection of signatures for the referendum and the decision of the CNE, and so it was a little bit to think about the futures of that would happen. Of course, as you probably know, on October 20, the National Electoral Council suspended indefinitely the referendum process, and this was followed by the following week by massive nationwide demonstration, leading to an ominous call for a march to the presidential palace on November 3 if the referendum was not restored. This call was ominous because it was precisely a march to Miraflores that in April 2002 had led to violence and a short-lived coup against Hugo Chavez. But simultaneously with this growing street mobilization, a dialogue process began. Now, after about 6 months of noises from both sides about Vatican mediation of a dialogue, the Pope sent Monsignor Claudio Maria Celli, who is sort of his most important, his highest level envoy to Venezuela, and started to meet with both sides. Now, the first substantive meeting of the dialogue on October 30 led the opposition to call off its march on Miraflores the next day, as well as the political trial that the National Assembly was planning on doing with Nicolas Maduro. The result has been a new degree of uncertainty. There's a mix of optimism that this dialogue could lead to a breakthrough, with pessimism that this dialogue is simply being used by the government to buy time. So today we have the benefit, the honor of having three of the most important Venezuelan thinkers and commentators on Venezuelan politics. Margarita Lopez Maya is a Venezuelan historian who has been perhaps the most important political analyst during the entire Chavez period. Luis Vicente Leon is the president of Data Analysis, Venezuela's leading pollster and interpreter of public opinion. And Francisco Rodriguez, the head of Torino Capital, has been the most accurate interpreter of Venezuela's economic realities in recent years, as well as one of the most accurate analysts and predictor of Venezuela's elections, for example, the 2015 legislative elections. So I'd like to start by talking about the dialogue and start with Margarita and ask you about the dialogue. Of course, it's always good. It's hard to ever be against dialogue. It's always good when two conflicting sides get together and talk. But I want to ask you, does this dialogue represent, in your view, really a positive opportunity or breakthrough, or is it really something that's simply muting the opposition's response to this suspension of the referendum process?
Well, good morning to you all. It is a pleasure to be here. I thank Vola for the invitation in this moment of, as David says, of so much uncertainty. Well, I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge here is the context in which the dialogue takes place. And I would say that this and the features of this dialogue, of the rivals that are sitting on the table. I think that all dialogue processes have particularities, and I would like to acknowledge here briefly the particularities of the Venezuelan case, because I think there could be a misunderstanding. Usually, dialogues take place after a war or after some bloodshed, or when you face a dictatorship that has lost his legitimation and has to leave. But in this case, we are looking at a government that was elected unfairly, if you want, in a very unfair competition, but elected, that has, in the last 3 years, walked little by little into an authoritarian regime. He has become this year, I think, with very precisely a dictatorship. Why do I say that? Because of the events that have happened in 2016. Ever since the elections of 2015, the parliamentary, there was a very clear mandate of the Venezuelan people for a political change. But as the session of the parliament began, Maduro and his entourage, his loyal group that surrounds him, decided, has always been their policy, not to dialogue, not to negotiate, and not to have any change. And so as the year went by, in order to accomplish this objective, they have been moving towards, I think, what we can now call properly as a dictator. Castrating the National Assembly, taking away 3 deputies so that the National Assembly could lose its 2/3 representation, the majority of the 2/3, of exception, to justify bypassing the National Assembly that has continuously taking out decisions so that the National Assembly cannot do its job, and finally, with the last suspension of the presidential recall, suspending the right to vote of the Venezuelan people until further notice. So what we have on one side of the table is a dictator, is an authoritarian regime that has the army backing him, paramilitaries backing him, has, so to say, his big resources is that he controls all the institutions of the Venezuelan state except the National Assembly. And on the other side, you have an opposition formed by more than 18 parties called La Mesa de la Unidad Democrática that is asking to come back to the rule of law, unarmed and civilian. I don't know if you want to go into the strengthness and
if you could tell us a little bit about the opposition coalition that's dialoguing. It's interesting. We've seen in the opposition over the past 3 months sort of a showcase of some of their problems of coordination. And I think we've seen some real shows of strength, like the 1st of September massive march, followed by some very underwhelming initiatives. Indeed, even going to this dialogue, they sort of stumbled into the dialogue with Jesus Torrealba, the head of the MOOD, agreeing to dialogue without apparently other leaders even knowing about it, and having a very public dispute about this. And so how can we understand some of these problems of coordination with the opposition going into this dialogue?
Let me just finish my idea. So I think I try to make clear that this is a very asymmetric table. And then the Vatican comes in, and the international community in some way puts a lot of pressure also, the Inter-American, the OAS, and so on. But I think there is like different perspectives about the situation, because I think this particularity that we are facing is not so common among negotiation tables. And so there is this idea that we're going into some kind of civil war or bloodshed, when it is very difficult for something like that to occur, because all the arms are on one side of the table, and the other side of the table is civilian and unarmed. So now let's talk about the opposition. The opposition goes into the table very weak. Its big strength is that it is supported by the people that gave them the mandate for political change, the 6th of December, and ever since has asked for a change of the policies. Venezuela is living a very severe economic and social crisis. We are sitting on a bomb, and in a way the people have not burst. There has not been an explosion here. I think because the people are waiting for a peaceful way out of the situation. And so what happens with the opposition? The opposition has had success as an electoral machinery, so to say. They have been, since 2010, winning elections and improving their capacity to gain spaces in the local and regional situation, and now they have won the National Assembly. But they don't have a united strategy against the government. These are 18, 20 parties. It is not easy to have a clear perspective of how to face a government that has moved from competitive authoritarianism into sheer dictatorship, and they always have a lot of difficulties in order to know how to diagnose the situation and how to face it. And of course, they have a lot of, they are very fragmented. They have leaders that compete among themselves. This is normal among political parties. But in this situation, it looks like out of touch many times in Venezuela. And so they had asked for the Vatican to come in. The Vatican comes in and is today the mediator on the table. And as I say, I think the Vatican is objective of the Vatican is to impede some kind of bloodshed or civil war. And I think it stabilize the country before an explosion. And on the other side, the Mesa Unidad Democrática, I think, went to the table with no clarity of what it was looking for. And in a way, when they spent in the first encounter, they spent 7 hours to decide who was going to sit at the table. And that was the same Sunday they had to sit on the table. And so half an hour before the table start is when they had the time to say what they were going to do. And so this is just an expression of the weaknesses. They have had success in electoral topics and electoral strategies, but they still are far away from a united strategy of how to represent that immense discontent that is in Venezuela and how to give a proposal for the future. And so I think that the table has been going on with very incoherent, to say the least, about what the Venezuelan people want. On the other side, I just wanted to say, well, we know what the strengths of the government are. His weaknesses is that he has lost popular support. There is no way, I think Luis Vicente will talk about that, no way he can win an election. And so he has walked out of the rule of law and has been he does have a unique command, and then he has been much more skillful on the table and has been able to not only gain time, but I think also has gained legitimacy as a dictator. Because I think that at the end of the day, the international community says, oh, the dialogue is working, And so there is he gains with this, and with his democratic and peaceful rhetoric of dialogue, he gains some legitimacy that he does not have among the majority of the Venezuelan people.
So, Margarita, then what can we expect from the dialogue? Do you think that there's a chance? I mean, always when there's a dialogue, sometimes it looks quite pessimistic, but these things can take on a life of their own. Can you imagine anything positive or unexpected or any kind of progress coming out of the dialogue? And then if you could follow that and tell us what you think the international community can do. What can the international community do that will not be self-defeating and destructive?
Well, what a positive can come out of the dialogue? For me, it's very difficult. I see some optimism amongst certain political parties that took the initiative of going into the dialogue, specifically Un Nuevo Tiempo and Avanzada Progresista of Falcón, and basically they are the leaders in this situation. They think something can be accomplished here. I'm an academic, so I don't have to talk as a politician. I I think very little can come out right now. I think very little can come out right now because I think that the strategy of the opposition to give in, it's the resources it had on the negotiation table without asking first for the government to show some signals of reciprocity, has weakened them on the table. As many of you may know, three documents came out last Saturday from that table. One that was publicly read by the Vatican, and with the two political poles. The second that was only read by the opposition, and the third that was also that was called Convivir en Paz, that was also read by both political partialities. But the document that was read by the Pope and the document that was read by the opposition had different contents. For example, the document that was read by the Poles was an official discourse document. It talked about economic sabotage. It talked about desacato of la Asamblea Nacional. And it didn't talk about political prisoners and so on. The one that was read by the opposition by himself talked about the liberation of political prisoners. The rumors and what Chuo Torrealba has said as the Secretary of the Moon is that in hours we were going to, and Ocariz, is that in hours we were going to see the political prisoners liberated. And they were talking about 70 or 75. This is Friday. Last night they freed one political prisoner that is very, very sick, and that I think they just freed him out of frightenness that something could happen to him and they would be in trouble with this prisoner. But I mean, we keep on waiting after 5 days for some other. Maduro has continued insulting the Sala Constitucional, the Constitutional Court, has put out a sentence this week prohibiting the National Assembly to continue the evaluation of the political responsibility of the president, and prohibiting him to call for protests in the streets. So, I mean, as an academic, I see very little improvement because I don't see the goodwill, any signal of goodwill on the part of the government. As for what can be done, well, I think the first thing is things like this that help understand the particularities of the situation. I mean, the Venezuelans are playing their democracy in this process, not a civil war, not a bloodshed, the democracy, the the recovery of the liberal institutions that are, of the liberal rights that are in the Constitution. Our institutions of independence, of the public powers, pluralism, the right to vote, this universal suffrage. And I think that what the international community can do is be aware of the situation, of the difference of the situation in regard to other situations, and to put the pressure on in the international agencies, in the international spaces, in order so this message comes out. And as they have resources, the Venezuelan government is in very bad shape economically, and so there could be threads with the economic helping that the Venezuelan people much need, but that also, is my understanding, has happened in other countries that have negotiated, in Africa, for example, that those financial negotiations also come with some pressures over, in the case of Venezuela, not to open Venezuela to a liberal democracy, because the constitutional, I repeat, is a liberal democratic constitution. It has direct mechanisms and participative mechanisms, but it is basically a liberal democracy, a representative democracy constitution, that we come back to the rule of law.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, we're going to be taking questions with note cards that will be passed out during the discussion. And so when you can write out a question and pass it to the aisle, and we'll be picking it up continually. And when the speakers are done, then we will go to the questions. Thank you. Luis Vicente, just ask straight out, why doesn't Venezuela explode?
Well, this is the question of my wife every day. Well, of course, it's a multifactorial thing. The first one is that even in the economic field, if you check what is happening, the government is somewhere trying to handle the situation. Everybody is talking about the huge crisis, and we are living a huge, really huge crisis in Venezuela. But at the same time, the government, for example, is creating some exits for it. For example, right now, in the very beginning, they start trying to manipulate the economy through the resellers. We call them bachaqueros. The people talk about the huge problem in scarcity, and we have a huge scarcity in Venezuela. But at the same time, a lot of poor people were for 8 to 9 hours in line to buy goods in the supermarket or in Mercal or the public expenditures, etc. And the people thought that these guys were absolutely, angry in the line. But in reality, they were working. They spent 7 to 9 hours in line to buy things that the government sell to them in a very, very cheap prices, and they resell them to the medium class and high class people. It was in 2015, and the difference between the regulated prices and the free market prices were about 10 times. And they obtained a lot of extra income doing that. Of course, it was not the total of the poor people. Of course, the poor people is having a lot of problems, but a lot of people there work. And you can find, for example, young men working as a resellers in Venezuela. They didn't have time to, any rebellion or to participate in social outbreaks or whatever. They were working, and a kind of redistribution of income coming from the high and medium class people, paying to the poor people for that. The crisis become worse after that, of course, because we reduce production and reduce imports in order to face the situation. And the government decided to create a new strategy to calm down people. And it was the clubs. They create a kind of distribution of food through bags of food that they give to the poor people directly. They somewhere expropriate the bachaqueo and decide something like this: I am spending a lot of dollars and I don't have too much, and now these goods are going to the medium class because they are paying a lot of money. Being honest, this year, in the very beginning of 2016, the difference between the black market prices and the regulated prices were not 10 as in 2015. We're about 80 to 100 times the price. And a normal bachaquero was getting more than 15 times the minimum salary working there. Well, but in this moment, they didn't have enough goods because we don't have, we decreased production, internal production, and the government decreased the imports in Venezuela. So they need to concentrate the goods that they have just to give them to the poor people and try to calm down them. But how they control the other side, the other cluster, the medium class and the high class? They, in fact, allow them to import directly with their dollars, opening the frontiers, the borderline with Colombia and Brazil, and allowing de facto, allowing the private importers to bring goods, of course, in an amazing price, because they have to calculate it in the black market, because it was using their own dollars. Yeah, of course, the prices went up, but at the same time, for example, in our last poll, and I was absolutely surprised for it. Well, it's incredibly the quantity of people who said to us that they are receiving the clubs. In the very beginning, I thought it was a crazy thing. It was impossible.
How much?
It's interesting because we have two kind of studies, different studies. The national omnibus said that about 50% of the people said that they receive a club. It doesn't mean that they are receiving it regularly, but they had some contact with it. If we go for a more specific study about the clubs and using not just the cities, etc., because it's easier for them to give bags of food in a big city, and you take into account the rural areas, this number is less than that, but it's about 30 to 35 of the total population, which is a lot. Being honest, it's a lot. And at the same time, a lot of people is able to buy things even cheaper than in the black market before that. Look at this graphic. I for example, study in the Twitter and Instagram in Venezuela the moment when a lot of Venezuelans cross the borderline to Colombia through the Puente Simón Bolívar, the Simón Bolívar Bridge. The day that they opened that, it was a huge quantity of people crossing the bridge. And a lot of people in Venezuela said, this is like the Berlin Wall. This is the end of Maduro. Look at this quantity of people crossing the borderline, looking for food because they are, desperate. In reality, you cannot compare it with Biafra or Haiti or Ethiopia or wherever. Why? Because you cannot imagine anybody coming from Africa to Italy through boats, go to Italy, buy things, and come back. And it was what happened in the Simón Bolívar Bridge. The people went to Cucuta, buy things in the Super Éxito, a big supermarket, and went back to their homes with their goods. And the most interesting thing was that they bought it in Venezuela, because the difference inside was 80 to 100 times, and the international price were by far cheaper. In reality, in this very moment, if you want to buy a rice kilogram, for example, 1 kilogram of rice, you're going to pay about 3 times the international price, 3 times the price that you paid here in Washington. I have paid 3 times in Caracas, which is crazy, because the distortion inside. But if I go to Cucuta, I buy them in, half price or something like that. They create a kind of exit to the, pressure of explosion.
And what about, for example, okay, so there's a series of escape valves that the government has found in terms of the economic scarcities. What about in terms of, for example, street protest? I mean, there's some. It's not easy to understand, because on the one hand, your polls consistently show that around 70 or more % are not willing to participate in marches, and about half of those express a fear of repression, and that's why they don't participate. On the other hand, we have seen some significant mobilizations, September 1, the end of October also, in which hundreds of thousands of people have gone out in the street. And so, what about in terms of how has a lid been kept on the protest?
Yeah, this is interesting. I have to say that it's clear that the majority of Venezuelans want changes, and they want Maduro out of power, and they are absolutely looking for these changes, and they want to participate. But they don't want to, at least in this very moment, because it's very important to clarify that if you ask people, hey, do you want to solve the problem through the Pacific way or to a war? Everybody's going to say a Pacific way. If I ask people, do you want to fight against Maduro? They are going to say, well, I'm not sure, but But at the end, it depends on a lot of other factors, because the people, for example, become more radical when they are, fighting on the street or protesting, even in a pacific way. It could become a radical action immediately. And it's, let me put it in an example. If you ask my wife, as an anecdotic thing, right now, if she's able to go to Miraflores and march to Miraflores, she's going to say you, oh no, she is a radical people and oppositor. And she went to the big march who take Chavez out of power. But if you ask her, hey, do you want to go to Miraflores right now? She's going to say you, no, because I have a little kids. I cannot put me into risk, because it's a risk for my kids. But in the last march against Chavez, when my kids were 2 years old, she went there. But she went there because nobody called her to go to Miraflores. She was protesting in a pacific way in La Mercedes, and suddenly the massification process and the leaders conduct them to go to Miraflores. There was a quite different situation, a social situation. And right now, if you call them for a war, the majority of the people is going to say, no, I can't. Because I have seen the arms, the big arms from the military. And this is not a dilemma between going to Miraflores and the politicians in Venezuela, and try to put this as a dilemma, going to Miraflores and take Maduro out, or negotiate with the government. This is not as simple as that. Because in the very beginning, I have to say two important things here. First of all, I don't think right now the people can go to Miraflores and kick Maduro out easily, as they did with Chavez. And with Chavez, it lasts just 3 days. And it's not easy to go to Miraflores if you announce that you are going to go to Miraflores, because he is going to protect himself, and he controls arms, military institutions, money, and whatever. And being honest, when the march kicked Chavez out, they didn't arrive into Miraflores. They repealed it in El Calvario, far from Miraflores. And what happened at the end? The military, taking advantage of the situation, kicked Chavez out. So you have to answer not if you are able to go to Miraflores. The real answer is if you have the relationships, the links with the military who is going to complete the actions that you're going to take. Otherwise, you could be in Miraflores, but it's not going to be a heroic and epic march. And this is the first mistake. They are offering and creating false expectations about the idea that you can kick Maduro out in a one big march to Miraflores. This is not true. You can maybe create the environment into troubles. And I think the opposition has the right and the necessity to participate and defend their rights, but not in the way that they are talking about. That not the way in explain it in the simplistic idea that they are going to march to Miraflores and finish this story, because this is not going to happen. And on the other hand, when they go to the negotiation table, I agree with Margarita that the opposition is so divided and weak, and a lot of differences, a lot. The way of thinking, the leaders, etc. But being honest, if you go for a dialogue table, the first important thing is that I don't want to evaluate the result of the dialogue for the first movement. Because the dialogue process has to be long and have to happen a lot of things. And right now, they are in the first step. The first step was bad, yes, I agree. Very bad. The document is absolutely unacceptable. They use symbols of the Chavismo all around the speech, and I think they lost dramatically in terms of symbols. But at the same time, I have to say that in any dialogue, you cannot obtain what the opposition is saying that they are looking for. Opposition is saying that they are talking to the government in order to have a recall referendum, or to to have a general election before 2018. The possibility to obtain that is a limit trend to zero. It's almost absolutely impossible in any dialogue or negotiation. Why? Because if you analyze the theory of negotiations, you have to complete this phrase. Hey, Maduro, give me your head, because if he goes for a recall referendum or a general election, he is absolutely out. He cannot win any possibility. He cannot win. So, Maduro, give me your head right now, or what is the rest? So, your head now, or what? What else? What could be?
Head.
What could be worse to his own head immediately? If you cannot complete it, you don't have any opportunity to negotiate the head of Maduro. It's absolutely impossible. So if you create this expectation, you are creating your own derrota, fracaso, defeat, because it's impossible to fulfill the expectation that you are creating. I think, and I finish with it, that the opposition committed a lot of mistakes. I think they have to continue defending their rights, participating, putting a lot of pressure to the government, because otherwise they are not going to find anything important in a negotiation. But at the same time, I strongly believe that they need to negotiate, because even though my wife is worried about the recall referendum and the general election, I am very worried about the presidential election in 2018, because the stimulus to block the recall referendum and block the general election is still there in 2018 for the presidential election if you don't negotiate with them. If they think that they are into risk, they think that you are going to follow them, to imprison them, to destroy them, and the military, they are not going to allow any presidential election, because they can't. You have to press to have the institutions, environment, negotiation to allow us to have a kind of democracy in 2018.
So, and what would you say? What would be a role for the international community that the international community could play that would be constructive, would not be self-defeating? No, so many types of measures that the international community can take, things like sanctions, end up simply increasing the exit costs for some of the people in the government. So, what kind of pressure or what kind of engagement could be fruitful?
I agree with Margarita. The international community is going to be very important in this story, and they have to participate, to take care about it, to put a lot of pressure through the international institutions, agreements, and whatever. I think this is going to be very important, and this is the reason that I celebrate that we have a kind of dialogue or negotiation, even if the results are not so good yet. I think the possibility to have some countries as Argentina or Brazil, the UNASUR, which is a little different than the UNASUR that Chavez created in the very beginning, Vatican, and etc. And as soon as you allow a lot of countries and international community go to Caracas and participate, you are putting some pressure into the government, because it's not true that they are not going to take care of any of them in the future. You are involving a lot of people, and it could be some more pressure. But I absolutely reject the idea that you can help creating more sanctions or fighting against Maduro in the hard way. For example, if I imagine how can President Trump materialize his offer to help Venezuela, as I know he is not going to help sending any Marines, and I am pleased about that because I reject it dramatically. The other possibility is to attack Maduro, who help him to create a concrete enemy. And the second important thing is to create sanctions against the guys in the government of Maduro. as soon as you increase, I am not trying to help them or to defend the people, because maybe they are guilty of all of these things. But what I think is that if you increase the list of people with sanctions in the United States for human rights, for narco traffic, or whatever, you are increasing a lot the army of kamikazes who cannot put their nose in Cucuta, and they have to defend the government of Venezuela inside, fighting for it. So you are putting a lot of pressure to avoid any possibility of negotiation, to have a pacific way in the future. This is what I think in terms of the sanctions.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about the economy a bit with Francisco, and remember the questions. If you have questions, when Francisco is done, then we're going to go to.
About the politics.
We'll get to that.
How can
We'll
you
get
do
to
that with Francisco?
We'll get to that. We'll start with the economy, and I'm sure it's going to get to the politics as well.
It's warm here.
Okay, so the thing is, in Venezuela, politics and economics are so tightly tied. And in fact, you hear one of the ways that people think about, how is this crisis going to end? Is there any way out of this crisis? People often think, well, what's going on with the economy? At some point, the government's going to need some kind of external funding. It's going to have some kind of crisis, and there's going to be some kind of economic negotiations. Now, you have said, I was just looking at your last report, that you think that Venezuela should be able to pay its debt in 2017. It doesn't have a reason to default, that it should be able to roll over some of its debt. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, something that's remarkable about Venezuela in the past few years is that we've seen a huge external adjustment. We've seen, if you look at imports of goods and services, they've gone down from $85 billion in 2012 to $30 billion this year. And quite frankly, they could keep on going down. So when you look at the funding picture, you kind of have to take this into account. It's not on?
Check the mic.
Hello?
Yeah.
Now?
Okay, yeah.
So just to repeat myself, the imports of goods and services have gone down from $85 billion to $30 billion since 2012. So when you think about whether the government has enough money or not, we're asking the question of whether the government has enough money to pay for its expenditures, and its expenditures are those imports. Well, it actually turns those $30 billion of imports of goods and services. If you look at the prices, at least, that we're expecting, or that futures markets are expecting for oil next year, you get a relatively small current account deficit. This year, 2016, the current account deficit was around $6 billion, but oil prices are going to be higher. I'm not saying it, futures markets are saying it. They're going to be higher in 2017 than what they were on average this year. And that implies that the current account deficit, if imports remain pretty much where they are right now, should be around $1 billion. That means that the government is going to need its total financing needs, all the money that it has to come up with, the hard currency that it has to come up with, are roughly around $8 billion. And frankly, I mean, that might sound like a large number. It's not really that large a number. When you take into account that about $2 billion of those tend to be multilateral financing or loans, which are typically rolled over, which have been being rolled over in the past few years and will continue to be rolled over, then you're talking about around $6 billion. And I'm sure that the government can come up with ways, for example, such as an issuance like what was done using the backing of 50% of CITGO. There's another 50% of CITGO that hasn't been used. They can come up with international resources, and that it can issue debt, because it has been issuing debt. It has been issuing liabilities. For example, there's the CITGO-backed issuance is a liability. There have been other liabilities that have been issued this year, for example, by PDVSA. So I don't think that, I mean, if the question is it inevitable that they will run out of money this year? No, I think that that it's not, and I think that it's the wrong question to ask. I mean, financial markets have been looking at Venezuela, and many analysts have been looking at Venezuela under the car heading towards a cliff metaphor. And if the idea is that this is simply a car, it's going at a certain speed, it's heading towards a cliff, and when it falls over the cliff, it's just a matter of time. It's kind of like an elaborate SAT question. Basically, the job of us analysts is to find out what the distance is to the cliff. That's the amount of international resource. What's the speed that the car is going at? That's the rate at which they're burning the resource. terms, and then some of us say, oh, it's the fourth quarter of 2017 that they're going to run out of money. But no, that's not what you have, because when you have a government that comes in and cuts imports from $85 billion to $30 billion, you have a guy who slapped on the brakes. I mean, the problem with Venezuela was not that it didn't adjust. The problem was that the driver actually told all the passengers to take their seatbelts off before adjusting. So now the kids have hit their head on the windshield, they're bleeding, the mother is screaming, trying to take away the steering wheel from this madman, and the car might actually go over the cliff because they're fighting over it. That's the way in which I think we have to understand Venezuela. So what this economy, now what's interesting, and because I do want to get into the politics, because if you don't let me talk about the politics, I may get very angry. So what I think is actually nothing short of miraculous is that you've had this huge adjustment in imports, that you've had a decline of per capita income of 22% over the course of 3 years, and that Maduro still has 20% approval ratings. I mean, I think that if we had met here 3 years ago and we'd said, okay, well, let's go through this scenario, it would have been like a really gloomy, let's go through the worst case scenario. In 3 years, the economy is going to be in the middle of a hyperinflation. Cumulative GDP is going to have contracted by more than 20%. You're not going to be able to find an aspirin in Venezuela. Oil prices are going to have fallen from $100 to $30 a barrel. What chance would we have given to Maduro staying in power?
Very little.
Very little. So look, what I actually take out of this is the resiliency of Chavismo as a political movement. And I want to focus on one piece of data that I'm going to steal away from Luis Vicente's polls, which is that Chavez's approval ratings right now are at 50%. So half of Venezuelans continue to believe that Chavez was a good president. And what that means is that I think that the idea that what we're going through is just the death of Chavismo and Chavismo refusing to die is a wrong idea to look through Venezuela. I think that we're going through an episode in which there was a very, very costly economic adjustment. I think that the economic adjustment could have been done a lot better, could have been done with less welfare consequences. So I think that people's welfare deteriorated by even more because of the way in which the adjustment was done. And then you have a very unpopular government, but that you still have a resilient political movement in which, in one way or another, a very large fraction of the population feels represented. And it takes me to a bit of what I think is the problem behind Venezuelan political institutions, because I totally agree with Luis Vicente that it's not. I mean, you can't go and negotiate with somebody and say, hey, please give me the keys to Miraflores Palace because I want to throw you in jail, right? I mean, that's not a workable negotiation. But why is it that we're thinking about the negotiation in these terms, and why is it that they're thinking about the negotiation in these terms? Because Venezuela does not have separation of powers. Venezuela doesn't have the basic institutions of a liberal democracy. Venezuela has a winner-take-all political system. The day that President Capriles or President Lopez or President Machado or President Lopez Maya gets into power, at the following day they can sign a decree and convene elections for a constituent assembly. And the constituent assembly can fire the Supreme Court, can fire the Attorney General, can fire the Ombudsperson, can effectively do away with all institutions. There is no effective separation of powers. This is a winner-take-all political system. And what we're seeing happen in Venezuela isn't because we Venezuelans like to fight with each other. We're actually a country in South America that has spent the longest amount of time without being involved in an internal or external war. No, it's because the political institutions that we have are institutions that are going to deliver this result. Unless you have a system, separation of powers is essentially about the protection of the minority. And the minority is now in power. They built institutions which they abused as a majority. It turns out that they're a minority. They don't want to give up power because they know that the equilibrium of these institutions is that the new majority is going to use that power and abuse it against them. So I think that what you're talking about, where the international community can help, and where I think that the dialogue process should go towards, is we're trying to build some of these institutions. I mean, the first thing that I think that if the opposition actually wants to produce a framework that can lead to a lasting and stable regime change in Venezuela, there would be some very interesting commitments that could be assumed in the framework of a negotiation that could be enshrined in a political reform. For example, a pre-commitment not to try to change the judiciary once it gets into power, not to try to abuse the institutions of the winner-take-all political system. Because that's the only way in which we are going to get into a system in which the rights of the minority to be able to carry out political activity are going to be respected at transition. If that doesn't happen, we're going to confrontation. If we go to confrontation, I think that the opposition might win. Because the opposition has the numbers right now, and it has the popular support right now. I think it's going to be worse for Venezuela. I think that if we go towards confrontation and the opposition wins, 10 years from now, we're going to sit here discussing the next iteration of Venezuela's political crisis.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the economic situation, one of the debates this year that I think has been most interesting has been this debate about the government's way of dealing with this crisis, and basically, as you just outlined, what they've chose to do is something that nobody thought they could do, which was this radical reduction of imports, and 65% reduction in imports. And some have argued, well, that actually that's an irresponsible way. That's too costly for the citizens. That the government is essentially saying it prefers to not default on international investors than feed its people. And so you've had a somewhat different perspective on that. How do you see that the relative weight of reducing imports versus defaulting?
I mean, listen, I don't believe in paying debts. If I could, I would default on all my credit cards. So I think it's totally true that governments, if they're really forced between paying for imports and paying debt, and particularly forced between paying for basic imports for their people, then they should choose to pay for these basic imports. But I don't think that that's the question that we're facing right now in Venezuela, because Venezuela has very peculiar characteristics. Venezuela is what is known as a sovereign exporter. So this is a sovereign debtor that also generates itself the foreign currency inflows of that the whole country runs on. So if Argentina defaults, bondholders can't go after Argentinian soybean exporters because their government defaulted. Because these are private firms, private agents, and they cannot be held liable for a debt that was contracted by the government. If Venezuela defaults, bondholders can go after PDVSA exports because Venezuela defaulted, because it is the same entity that defaulted. In fact, sovereign exporters tend to have a protection in international law, which is called the right of sovereign immunity. And the right of sovereign immunity means that you cannot attach sovereign assets. However, the right of sovereign immunity does not apply to corporations like PDVSA. So you can attach PDVSA assets, you can attach the receivables, the payments to PDVSA, the payments that are generated by PDVSA's export revenues. So effectively, bondholders have the power, the ability to be able to reduce the nation's foreign exchange earnings dramatically. So the government isn't actually choosing, well, between, I either do I continue paying or I default, and if I default, I'll have more money for my imports. No, if they default, they'll probably have even less money for their imports, and they'll have to cut imports by more. The reality is that when you look, for example, at the cases of some sovereign exporters that have defaulted, you can find some cases like that of Ecuador, and we did a study looking at how Ecuadorian oil prices declined during the period of default. It was a very atypical default because actually it happened in 2008, so the government actually had the money to buy the debt back, which is something that Venezuela can't do right now. But what we identified is that even despite the fact that it was relatively protected in many senses, there was a decline of between 15 to 20% in the prices that Ecuador could sell its oil at during the period of default. If Venezuela actually paid that price, and there are good reasons to expect that it would be higher, you'd be talking about a loss of around $6 billion in export revenue, and you're not going to save that much more with the default. I mean, you'll probably save less than that if you look at savings from say, Ukraine's restructuring. They're about that. So I don't think that the proposition pays off in the Venezuelan case, and I think that the government has recognized that. I mean, there are this debate did emerge in February of this year. The economics vice president briefly The person who briefly occupied that position, Luis Salas, proposed a moratorium on the external debt. And the position of the government, the position, as I understand it, of President Maduro, was completely against that because they believed that they would be in a worse situation, that they would have less money to pay for imports if they had done so.
So one thing we haven't talked about, I mean, thinking about the crisis and this dramatic reduction in imports, I mean, the elephant in the room is the foreign exchange distortions. No, we have the lowest bolivar rate is 10 bolivars per dollar. Now the parallel rate is pushing 2,000. So this creates enormous incentives for corruption. So the problem that we're confronting in terms of having enough dollars for goods that people need to consume, is it how much of this is because of the decline in oil prices, and how much of this is because the government or the money is simply going to corruption or to other ends or capital flight?
I mean, there's something that maybe it's difficult sometimes for us economists to get across, but scarcity is essentially a reflection on price controls. When you have scarce goods, it means, and when you have lines of people who are lining up to buy a good, it means that the goods price is not being allowed to get to a market clearing level. If you didn't have price controls, then you could have expensive goods, and then you could have people very angry because they're not able to afford the goods. So I'm not saying that it's any better. Actually, I think that probably the government's resilience, political resilience, had to do with being able to identify that a very, very strong adjustment of the official prices of these goods would have been way, way unpopular. So I think that that we're kind of facing this situation where there is where these price distortions are prevalent in a society. There is excess demand for a lot of these goods. They generate arbitrage opportunities. But interestingly, what's been happening over the course of this year is that there has been a pretty significant adjustment in those arbitrage opportunities, and some of them have been quite limited. I mean, in the sense that, for example, the government has basically stopped giving out dollars at 10 to anybody in the private sector. The people who in the private sector have access to dollars at the decom rate. What you've seen is that there have been the government is not strictly enforcing the price controls as it was in the past. It is enforcing them on the goods that it itself brings and that it makes available to people. That those goods are marked at the time of change rate. But even in those, it has actually been accepting some time adjustments. So what I think that we're seeing is that this year you've seen three interesting phenomena. You've seen somewhat of a decline in the magnitude of those foreign exchange and also as well price distortions. Although the government hasn't said it, everybody has been expecting, oh well, the government's going to announce that they're going to unify the exchange rate, that they're going to lift exchange controls. No, they don't announce anything. They don't say anything. They just do it. They've been doing it, and therefore the price system has normalized somewhat. And in fact, we're seeing in some of the private studies like we said this, that the perception of supply of this again, those perception of supply conditions has actually improved over the past few months. What we've also seen, we've seen the import adjustment that we were describing, and we've seen a very sizable fiscal adjustment. Now, we've lost some of the data here because the government is very vague with the data, but we can look at the budget and how the budget has evolved. And the authorized budget, which is the original budget plus additional budgetary authorizations through the year, which is essentially the maximum of what the central government can spend, has gone up by 151% from compared to the same moment last year. You might say, wow, that's a big 151%. No. I mean, if you have between 300 and 700% inflation, that's small. Actually, if you look at the lower bound of existing inflation estimates, it's a 29% cut in real government spending. So it's a cut in government spending of about 10 points of GDP. So again, I mean, what you see is a very costly adjustment, but the adjustment has taken place both at the fiscal and at the level of imports and at the level of the normalization of some prices. What's the reality is the one that was living on $100 oil, and therefore the society is going to adjust to living in lower living standards. And yes, I mean, Venezuelans are now, in terms of real per capita income, 22% poorer than they were in 2012. What I think that we're going to have going forward rather than the hyperinflation scenario that some people were anticipating, I think that we're probably going to have some level of stabilization at low levels of income, at levels of income which are way, way below than those that Venezuelans were used to.
Okay, and so as a final question, in thinking about the dramatic foreign exchange distortions and some of these pricing distortions, some of these things aren't all that hard to understand yet. Consistently, all of us, I think, 3 years ago were saying, oh, the government was going to have extensive economic reform within weeks or months, and here we are 3.5 years later. There's been no real reform of the basic economic structure, and especially these foreign exchange distortions. How do we understand this lack of change? Is it ideology? Is it stakeholders? How do you see it?
I think it's ideology, but I think it's, I probably don't want to, we shouldn't call it ideology. I think people who are governing have a different paradigm, and their paradigm is one in which they don't really believe in the market system. I think that Maduro, so I had the opportunity to work together with UNASUR over the course of the summer in setting up an alternative economic program, basically trying to give the government a set of ideas as to how they should be running the economy. And what we found there was that there was actually a lot of support for that program in the government, except for a very small group, which is a group very close to President Maduro. This includes foreign advisors like Alfredo Serrano, some prominent cabinet members such as Ricardo Menendez, and I think that their view, and I wouldn't call it ideology because I think that ideology is a very arrogant term. It basically assumes that the person that you're discussing with is wrong and you're right. I think that they have a different view of how the economy works. I believe that my view is right, but they believe that their view is right. And their view is essentially one in which relative prices shouldn't be doing the allocation of resources. And once you really dig down, this is very much a view, a traditional Marxist view of central planning, in which the state, they really can't understand, ethically they can't accept the idea that if goods are scarce, then the way to adjust to that is to have higher prices, and that the markets will carry out the allocation of resources, and that you should somehow compensate through redistribution. Their response to that is, well, no, the government produces the dollars here. They're not even produced by the private sector, so we need those dollars to import the things that people need, and if there aren't dollars, we're not going to make those goods more expensive. We're going to bring those goods to people, and maybe directly through the class. And then this year, we don't import TVs. There are no dollars for TVs. And then if the private sector has some dollars, they can use them for importing TVs. What's the problem? I think that there are many problems. This is the view of economics that was adopted by centrally planned economies for several decades in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, today still in some places like North Korea. Now, I don't like that way of running an economy. I think it's an inferior way to that of running it through a market system, and I think that you can offset the distributive implications of the price system through redistributive policy. But I think that the problem of the government is that it can't even do that. It can't even have a centrally planned economy. It's stuck in the middle between a centrally planned economy and a market system. And therefore, they're trying to do central planning in an economy where still 60% of resource allocation is done by the private sector. So you're basically leaving the private sector without a price system. And that actually is like leaving an economy without a steering wheel. That's like finding out that the steering wheel kind of went up, and now there's no way to control the car.
All right, we're going to get to some questions, but let me first just give each of you a couple of minutes for an additional comment if you want to follow up on something or take issue with something you've heard.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted I do agree, and I think it has been very interesting, some of the things that have been said here. I just wanted to put in the picture civil society, social organizations, the base of society. Because I think that one of the big problems that we are facing in Venezuela to recover the democratic institutions, and that there seems to be very little connection between society and the political actors at this moment. If you go to the table and you see who's in the dialogue table, you just see the loyal group of people that follow Maduro in the cabinet. You see Agua, you see Charlotte, and practically you don't see any connection of those cuadros of the cabinet with the PSUV, with the Chavistas, with the Chavista people. If you go to the other side of the table, then you see political parties that have asked for a strike of 48 hours without consulting the entrepreneurs or the unions, or you see saying that they're going to Miraflores in a huge, massive march without consulting any organizations of civil society. So we see a very big disconnection between representation of a society that is in very severe stress. And I think that there cannot be a recovery or a solid negotiation if the channels between society and political actors are not constructed. Venezuela has, because it has been a petro state for so long, has had a very weak civil society. This is civil society today. I go to a lot of meetings to them right now. They are trying to build up, because they feel very disenchanted by the political actors. They are trying to build platforms and to converge for the recovery of democracy. And they are trying to also put together proposals in order to go to the Vatican and have to be heard by the principal mediator. The second thing, so I think that this will take time. The second thing I want to say about the political actors is that I think that the failure of the dialogue table in its first steps has to do with the incapacity of the political actors to be in tune with the society. And we are running a risk of have a worse pact in Punto Fijo, an elitist pact between some political actors among themselves and leaving the people out. And so I think that a second thing I wanted to say about has to do with this kind of failed state that we are looking at. Venezuela is heading to a failed state, if it's not there already. I mean, this is a state that is not fulfilling its basic functions. It is not giving welfare to its people. It's not securing their life. It has basic services. We live with sometimes without water in many parts of the country, in many parts of the cities of the country, without light. They kill people on the streets every day. We're above 100% of homicide per inhabitant. In Caracas, above 110, one of the worst records of the world. We have an inflation, 450, some more or less around there right now, annual. So really, this is a thing that is not working. And then you have to come to the idea that Vicente and Francisco just said, and when they do the surveys, there's still 20% of popularity for Maduro, and there's 50% of sympathy for Chavez. And so this has to put us to think, because I really don't believe just because people are more or less living and doing more or less survival strategies to continue getting some food. We are going to continue in this situation for too long. So I really have, I can't answer that question, but I'm going to say a couple of things about it that I think are important. One, Robert Dodd always said that there are societies and in some certain moment think that democratic values are not important, and they give them up to other priorities. And I think that we may have to put that into our basket when we think right now. The hardships that cannot be expressed by the 22% of reduction of the income that Francisco has said. I'm a professor at the Central University of Venezuela, and if I go to the black market with my salary, I am high-ranked professor. It is not more than $40 a month. So, I mean, 22% does not express my impoverishment. And I think that maybe it could express some average in poverty of poor people, but of middle classes. No way. I mean, this is an empowerment way above that. And so, or feeding by the 2 out of 10 Venezuelans. Saying that the survey wasn't 100% reliable, but it is more or less. I mean, I live in Caracas. I go out, I see people starving with their children into the garbage. And so this is a failed state with a political system that does not express them sufficiently. And so I think that the most important thing that has happened in the dialogue table is it has brought sincerity to the situation. That the political actors do not reflect what we are feeling. And we do not trust them. Because they just gave in everything before they started negotiating. And you may say, well, we have to be optimistic. Yeah, we can be optimistic, but I mean, if these people don't know how to negotiate because they're so worried in seeing who's going to sit there and come out in the photo, I mean, we're in deep trouble. We're in deep trouble. So I just wanted to say that I think this is a long-term problem, but I think that the most important, and for us, at least as Venezuelans, is that the pressure has to come inside the country with a civil society that has to be supported in its reconstruction and in the building of channels among them and towards the political parties in order to put the pressure inside for the recovery of democracy in Venezuela, because I think the majority of the country, in spite of what I've said of Robert Dodd, wants a democracy in Venezuela. And I think that that has to be accompanied by an important international pressure among in the different inter-American agencies and the American and international governments also, because this will not change if these two things don't happen. I think that the government controls money, controls the institutions, but I do think that it is in heavy trouble. It has groups that are in completely illegal businesses, and there may be right now those that support them, basically, because they are afraid, they don't have where to live. Even presidents like Oscar Arias says the problem of Venezuela is that it's a narco state. It could be an exaggeration, but undoubtedly there are a bunch of military men and civilians that have big telephone books thick of drug trafficking and of accusations, and that is the minus, because we have the weapon smuggling, the gasoline smuggling, the food smuggling, and the exchange, how do you call that, crimes against the Venezuelan people.
Okay, Luis Vicente, a couple minutes.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have a disaster in Venezuela, and I am not thinking that it's going to be easy. I'm just saying that we have two options. Right now, I think we are going to have more in the future. But right now, you have the possibility to try to press changes and build a possibility to recover the democracy in not 1 year. In some time, we can recover some possibilities, or you are going to fight. Because you don't have, we have the third. Nothing's going to happen. And get like a process of habituation, get used to the primitivization of the country. And even though, as Francisco says, if I imagine that the people is going to get used to this disaster, I can say, no, they are not going. But 10 years ago, I couldn't imagine that the people was going to get used to it and allow the government to maintain it. But at least they didn't find the exit. They didn't find the way to change it. And at the very end, we are buying things I am, living in Caracas. So in some way, I am getting used to it, even though I try to change it and fight and whatever. At the very end, I work every day, and in the night I go to the supermarket, to the black market, to buy dollars to come here, and whatever. So I am getting used in some way to what is happening there. So you have three scenarios, in my opinion. Habituation, and it could happen. Because being honest, a lot of people in the rest of Latin America in the past live in worse conditions than Venezuelans now. It's not true that this is the worst crisis in Latin America. It's our worst crisis, and it's awful. And it's the biggest crisis from the last war in Venezuela. But I can show you a lot of people in Latin America in the last 4 years living worse than Venezuelans right now. And they live, and they got used to it, at least for a while. But the second scenario is that the people decide to participate and create the conditions for change. I agree with Margarita about this, the civil society, and it's not right now the star of the dialogue. It's not the star in politics. It's not the star in changes. It's true, but it could become different in the future. Why? Because, being honest, we are always talking about the last 18 years. The people has fight against it for 18 years and we couldn't. This is not true. The Chavismo is like facing for the first time the idea that they are minority. Because 3 years ago, they were not a minority. 5 years ago, they were not a minority. Even though if you check the speeches of the opposition, in terms of it, Chavez never won an election, they never won a majority, they always commit fraud, and the people didn't like them. It was not true. Chavez won any election. It doesn't mean that they didn't commit fraud. They commit fraud. And won election as well. Yeah, because they were popular. Chavez was not was popular, is popular. 50% of the people is still linked with Chavez. If you don't understand that, you cannot understand what happened in the past and what is going to happen in the future. So we are living a quite different situation. It's the first time that Maduro and his party of guys are a minority. And the society of Venezuela want changes. 80% of the people said that they want changes. 76 want Maduro out of power in this year. 94% of the people think that they are in the middle of a huge crisis. So this is going to be a stimulus to changes, not just in the government, changes in the opposition. And maybe it means that the people is going to look for somebody else different than what we consider right now the leaders of the opposition. And it will happen in Venezuela. I mean, not maybe this year, but I think it's going to happen.
Francisco, you have
Just very briefly, I want to hear the questions. I think it's natural in this type of setting that your sense of urgency and dismay at the current situation leads you to think that any project of change has to have an immediacy to it, that we have to do it now, and that it's not worth doing it if you don't do it now. And I've been through so many of these conversations in the past 18 years. I can remember people saying this back in 2002. The country will not be able to survive another year of Chavismo. And that's why we can't wait until the recall referendum in 2004. They would say we can't wait until the next presidential elections. And I think that we're really before a different problem. I think that this is a problem for the long run. I think it's a problem in which at some time, yes, I mean, people are all fired up and say they want to march to Miraflores. I think that's a moment for cooler heads to prevail. And I think that we have to look carefully at what it is that can be achieved and that is being achieved. I, for one, am willing to give the negotiations the benefit of the doubt, among other things, because I'm not sure that the other alternative is going to be any better. I'm not sure where a march to Miraflores is going to take us. I do think that if you talk to the negotiators and you analyze what is happening there right now, there is very serious discussion about having a balanced electoral council. There are, right now, in the electoral council, there's one opposition member and 4 government members. Of those 4 pro-government members, 2 are up for appointment right now, December 4th. Those electoral council members are appointed by a 2/3 majority of the National Assembly. As we know, right now there isn't a functioning 2/3 majority. It's also the case that one of them has to be a candidate of what in Venezuela is called the Poder Ciudadano, which I think the best translation of it is the what I call the accountability branch, which is the well, yes and no. I mean, I think that's it. You see, what I think is important to understand within the constitutional framework is that the National Assembly, even though, and what I'm trying to explain is that the National Assembly, even with the 2/3 majority, cannot appoint one of those electoral council members because it has to confirm a candidate from a set of candidates proposed by the Poder Ciudadano, by the accountability branch. What is currently under discussion in the negotiations is the possibility that there will be one of those electoral council members will be appointed by the opposition, that the government, in fact, even without the 2/3 majority, the government has committed to voting in favor of the opposition's proposal for appointing that member, and seeking that the member that is appointed by the National Assembly but is proposed by the Poder Ciudadano, by the accountability branch, is chosen by mutual agreement. So that we would end up with an electoral council that is balanced, in which there are 2 pro-government representatives, 2 opposition representatives, and 1 representative that is chosen by mutual agreement. Look, this might not happen. This might fall through. This may just be a bluff by the government. They might not intend it. Negotiations might break down. One of the negotiators might decide that it's just going to throw a plate at somebody else's head and stand up for the table. I mean, all of these things happen. But if out of this we get, and onto the question about by the way, of how these institutions are set up in the Venezuelan Constitution, the Electoral Council is an independent branch of government. What that means is that once you've appointed them, it's very, very difficult to fire them, and it's very, very difficult to take authority away from them. So if we end up with a neutral electoral council, with a balanced electoral council out of this, and we go into an electoral process of regional elections in 2017 and presidential elections in 2018, where the entity that organizes the electoral process, that sets limits on the campaign, and that counts the votes, is impartial, I think that will have been a great step forward for Venezuelan institutions. And if the negotiators can achieve that, then they certainly have my vote of support.
Okay, we have a stack of really excellent questions here, and I'm not sure we have time to deal with most of them. I've selected 3 that all have to do with the same topic. I'm going to read the 3 questions, and I'll give you each a couple of minutes to respond with. The first question, I apologize ahead of time for those questions we don't get to. It's just not possible to get to all of them. Okay, I'm still unclear as to what the presenters think the international community should do if sanctions have negative and undesirable consequences, and the idea is to support dialogue towards what? The second question is, besides the Vatican, do you think there could be another objective mediator for the dialogue? And third, we have seen international support to dialogue through declarations from several international organizations such as OAS, Mercosur, the European Union. We need to see a more realistic approach and stance, and not just imaginary support. Should countries have a stronger stance for respect for democratic values and its components? Should they engage in more pressure tactics, or should they step back? What role do international organizations have?
Yeah, let me see if I can be a little bit more precise. I have not said that the dialogue is not useful. I said that the way it has been conducted, it has been a failure in the recovery of democracy for Venezuela, which means that we will be undergoing probably, especially the opposition forces, a crisis. Because at the end of the day, wishful thinking about a neutral national electoral council. Listen, But I'm not a specialist in theory of negotiation, but as far as I have read, I've been reading about this in the last times, the government has no incentives to give up anything right now, because its big worry, preoccupation, was the street that was there that was going to Miraflores, and the possibility of a social commotion. Once that was put aside, once the political responsibility of Maduro was put aside out of goodwill, because the Vatican said that to suspend these things and to bring a signal of goodwill, what is the incentive for the government to negotiate right now anyway? I mean, he got what he wanted at the moment, so he can move forward until January, when the Constitution says that they stay in power until 2018. And then maybe we could have a negotiation table that could negotiate certain things. If you are convinced that you cannot win elections, and on top of that, now everybody says that the dialogue is functioning, what is the incentive of the government to put away his dictatorship status? I don't see it. I mean, honestly, I don't see it. If I'm in the negotiation table, I don't see why should I give up. I'm being legitimatized. I am being recognized as a legitimate government. And to bring in two and one, that is, forgive me, Cuarta República, because the Constitution doesn't say that. The Constitution doesn't say two and one. That is Pacto de Punto Fijo. The Constitution
So you prefer 4 to 1?
says.
Are you happier with 4 to 1?
What I'm saying is that if you're sitting on a dialogue table looking for democracy, you're looking to comply with the Constitution, not with a political pact of elites. You stay with two, I stay with two, and then we get a neutral. Because that's what we had in the fourth, and we don't want to repeat that. What we want is for the Constitution to start working. The Constitution says that the 5 members of the National Electoral Council have to be non-partisan. That's what the Constitution says. So I think, as is reflected here, that there is a lot of problems among to think about the way out, and I think that the civil society, maybe because I am more active there, I go there, is much more precise. We want back our right to vote. We want back our liberal representative institutions, our civil and political rights. That's what we want the job to be done on the dialogue table. And that is not what we're seeing. You are talking here about the judicial. I'll give the judicial to the government, and maybe he will negotiate to give us something. If you give the judicial to the government, I mean, we stay almost in the same status that we are right now, because the judicial right now is above the National Assembly. Dictates, says that the laws of the National Assembly do not prosper because we are in a state of exception and an economic emergency. And then they will bring up whatever other thing. So what I agree is that this is going to take time. And that this is that the opposition may be falling apart in the next weeks because of the failure to have had straight the objectives, and because I think the international community also had a mistaken view of what the situation in Venezuela was. Then let me go back to the international, more precise international. One thing that I said, because I've seen those experiences in Africa, is that if you have to go out to ask for money to international agencies, you have certain capacity to pressure the government to give. I give the money, but you'll comply with your constitution. I mean, right now, if he goes out to ask for money, he needs the approval of the National Assembly. You just wait and see. Maybe the mood next week will give him that tool. And then, I mean, because of the lack of view of the mood at this moment is overwhelming. So I do think that there are precise ways of doing that. I mean, for example, the OAS has come out a couple of days ago backing the dialogue, but saying the dialogue is for the restitution of the independence and separation of public powers, the comeback of pluralism, and the institutions of liberal democracy. That's what we need. Something like that is what we need, not a polarization of the international community, but an objective in tune with the Venezuelan people to recover their institutions, their constitution, and the rule of law. I know that is difficult. I know that maybe our political culture will take some time but you have middle classes, you have certain socialization. The right to vote in Venezuela is a very asset that we have. We want to get out of this in a peaceful way, voting. And so I think that is what is on that the opposition has to understand, that is on the table, and that is what the international community has to understand, that is on the table.
Well, maybe it's the place that I have here in the middle. I hear Margarita and agree with a lot of things. I hear Francisco and agree with a lot of things. Maybe
You should start calling you.
the moderator.
Put you
Yeah,
on the
this.
mesa.
Why? Because it's absolutely true that we are not going to have any important issues in the negotiation the way we have right now. I absolutely agree. Because, again, the same stimulus that I talk about with the head of Maduro is with almost everything. Right now, the opposition has no power of negotiation. And now, less than in the past. Because they abandoned the social pressure, which is the only thing you have. You are a majority. This is clear. You are a clear majority. But how can you convert the majority into kinetic energy? You have a potential energy, being a majority. But you have to convert it into kinetic energy. You can do it when you are a majority through two ways. Voting, and you can win because you are a majority. Or pressing. The pressure could be in a different way. Pressure could be in a radical way, or pressure could be in a pacific way. But pacific way means any way that you have to go to the street, to defend your rights, to be organized, to avoid that the government do what they want, to have some kind of civil disobedience. You have to do a lot of things, even in the pacific way. And if you don't do anything and you abandon this social pressure to go to the dialogue table, you're going to lose everything. Because you lose what you have. I agree with it, absolutely. It means that we need to have not negotiation or dialogue. Sorry, negotiation or social pressure. It's both of them. And the important difference for me in terms of the social pressure in the street or wherever, because it's not just the street. We're talking about the street pressure. Social pressure is in my work, in the school, in the university, wherever. You have to be fighting for your rights wherever. And it's not now or never. It's always doing that. And taking care about not to create false expectations, because at the very end you're going to be frustrated. But the difference in my vision to the radicals is that I am not going to make social pressure to kick Maduro out, or I am going to be, in a disaster. No. I want social pressure to change the country, to change, to recover institutions, and to have the opportunity to vote, and to have a stable future. Otherwise, I can maybe kick Maduro out, but I'm not going to have any stable country, because they are going to be in the other side with arms and money, and they are going to feel like in troubles and into risk, and they are going to fight against me, and I have a lot of things to do in order to recover economic equilibrium and social equilibrium in Venezuela. It's impossible to do it fighting. So I want to press right now in order to obtain a real negotiation, to recover my power of negotiation, to press. Otherwise, this is not going to work. You can change Maduro, but it doesn't mean that we are going to change the country. Venezuela has a long history of changing guys. Kick out Colón, Francisco de Miranda, Bolívar, Páez, Pérez Jiménez, los Adeco, los Copellanos. When we think that nothing could be worse than Chavez, we are living with Maduro. It doesn't mean change a guy.
It could be worse than Maduro.
No. Maybe it could be worse. I really think that something could be worse than Chavez, and it's clear that it happens. So what I'm thinking is, I agree with Margarita in terms of the necessity to increase the power of negotiation in order to have a real possibility in the dialogue. This is true. But at the same time, I agree with Francisco in that we are looking for pressure to change institutions, and it's going to take time, and we have to cross some steps. Margarita doesn't want 2-1, and in my opinion, and Francisco thinks that could have it 2-1. I think that we are going to have Margarita expectation and Francisco expectation. We are not going to have any 2-1. It is not going to happen right now. And it's not going to happen in the way we are.
I agree with you. It's not going to happen right now.
In the way we are, because we don't have enough negotiation power
The
to
difference
obtain
is
that
that
third
I'm
guy.
looking for the
If
constitution
I
and looking for
obtain it, I am going to be very happy. With 2-1, even though Margarita is true, I am going to be very, very happy if we have 2-1, because at least we have an opportunity. And we have to cross a lot of borderlines or frontiers. But it's not necessarily a nice news that we are going to have, for example, 2 guys in the Consejo Nacional Electoral, because it's not just a question of numbers. Even with 2 guys right now, we have to know when they are going to work, where they are going to work. Because if we have 2 guys from the opposition in the same commission that the guy working in the opposition is right now, we are not going to have any possibility to change anything out of the Junta Electoral and out of the register of electors in Venezuela. If you have 2 guys in the commission of Rondon right now, it doesn't mean anything except symbols. So, in order to obtain this, you need to increase your power of negotiation, and this is going to come from the people fighting for their rights or defending their rights.
Francisco, last word.
Actually willing to subscribe to mediators report. So look, actually, I don't disagree with you, Margarita. If you go back to what I said, I made a conditional statement, which is, if out of this process we get a 2-1, I think that will be a positive result, and I think that will lead to the strengthening of Venezuelan institutions. Would we want institutions in which all 5 are impartial, improved? I mean, at some abstract level, I want it, but I think it's completely irreal. Look, there's going to be enough trouble finding that one. Actually, I think that if they get the agreement, just finding that one, I'm not sure whether they're going to find 5 of those. I think that's impossible. You have to go to Mars. I do think that we have to have some sense of the real politics. We can all think about our ideal societies and whatever Germán Escarra was thinking when he was writing the Constitution, because he was the one who wrote that. But the reality is that look at the Bush v. Gore case here in the U.S. How did Supreme Court justices vote? All of those who have been appointed by Republican presidents voted in favor of Bush, and all of those who had been appointed by Democrat presidents voted for Gore. So if you don't, if you have those party splits in a very stable, very well-built democracy like that of the U.S., then of course you're going to have it in Venezuela. And therefore, I think that it's a reasonable institution to get out of Venezuela's political problem to try to have a neutral electoral council. And if that is achieved, then that will be a good result. Now, there's another completely different question, and that's why I put the emphasis on the if that is achieved, which is the strategy of negotiations that the opposition is following right now the best way to achieve it, or has it abandoned, has it given up some of its strength? Let me first of all agree with something. I think that there was some huge blunders in the Saturday negotiations, and I think it was a disaster that they subscribed that agreement, the agreement read by Monticelli, because that agreement basically says nothing. And if it says something, it actually says something in favor of the government. It copies some of the government's discourse. There was not even bargaining at the level of discourse. If you were going to say, yes, I'm going to sign something that says the sabotage and boycott against the economy, at least have the government to say, okay, humanitarian. You have to put in the word humanitarian. The word humanitarian was not there, sabotage and boycott. So first of all, I agree with that criticism to the concrete job that was done by the mediators. And I'm sympathetic to the criticism that the opposition, when it decided to go back on the protest agenda and to go back on the political trial against Maduro, may have lost negotiating power by doing that. I say I'm sympathetic. I'm less decisive about that because I do think that there's a possibility that the negotiators can now say that can say, okay, we showed our goodwill and you guys didn't live up to this. You said you were going to release 65 political prisoners. You've released just one. We're getting up and we're going back to that agenda. So I'm not sure that has been completely sacrificed. But I am sympathetic to the idea that there was actually no need to go to withdraw on some of those strategies, particularly the strategy at the level of the National Assembly, which I think the strategy at the level of the National Assembly is actually quite interesting. If you had the declaration of the absolute absence of Maduro, which according to the Constitution can be voted by a simple majority of the National Assembly, then you would have sat down at the negotiating table, and Maduro would have been saying, but you guys are not recognizing me as president. And I could say, okay, we'll recognize you as president. Now we have some things that you want to recognize. So I am sympathetic to that case. And I would point out that and here I'm again going to agree with our impartial mediator, which is that there's no contradiction between continuing the confrontation and negotiating. If you look, for example, at the Colombian peace agreement, at the moment at which the peace negotiations started, the FARC started saying, we want a ceasefire. And the government said, no, wait, we're not giving you a ceasefire. We'll give you a ceasefire once there's an agreement that we are comfortable with, and you guys have signed it and committed and have taken some concrete steps. There's no reason for me to give a ceasefire, because we're fighting about something, and we're fighting because we have this agreement. The dialogue is for us to stop fighting. The dialogue is not for me to stop fighting, particularly at a moment at which I have the upper hand. Now, however, the reason that I'm more nuanced in my statement is that I do believe that in the end, the result of the negotiations is going to tell us whether this strategy was successful or not. Because you talk about this with the mediators, and mediators tell you, yeah, that there were good reasons to suspend that for some moment, that they can go back on that they also have to demonstrate goodwill before the mediators. Maybe that's wrong, maybe that's right. I want to do a bit less of armchair quarterbacking. I'm just making a statement that if the result gives us a balanced electoral council, then I think we will have found a slower way than the one that we want to resolve Venezuela's political crisis, but I think a reasonable way. And I want a solution to that crisis for the well-being of Venezuelans. And here I want to make one comment about the sanctions issue. Back in 2003, Chavez was not at Maduro levels of approval ratings, but he was at low levels of approval ratings. He was at 30%. And he recovered. And one of the ways in which he recovered was, one of the things that helped him recover was the opposition going to a national strike. And the opposition, and effectively the government being able to say to Venezuelans, look, those guys really don't care about you. I mean, they don't care about people going unemployed. They don't care. They can shut down their stores because they're wealthy oligarchs. But yeah, they cannot have an income for 2 months. You can't have an income for 2 months. That was a very important and vital part of the way in which the government, which Chavez actually recovered political support during 2004, in fact enabling him to win the recall referendum. And this is the same exact consequence that sanctions would have, that tighter sanctions would have. They would show to Venezuelans that the opposition, if it's supporting them, and those international actors that carry them out, don't care about the well-being of Venezuelans. Actually, as a Venezuelan, I'm going to say something, now I'm going to sound very, very naive, because I've been talking about politics all the time, about real politics, and I'm telling you that Margarita is an idealist when she's thinking about having five Martians in the electoral council. And I'm going to tell you something. I cannot understand, as a Venezuelan, as somebody who has not only family connections, but just a basic sense of identity with the people who are suffering through this crisis, why it is not possible for the opposition and the government to, even if they're going to carry on with their political dispute, to reach agreement on some basic measures that would help improve Venezuelans' living standards. And I think that if any of them, so why is it, and this is the reason why I devoted 2 months of my life between my two most recent jobs to working with UNASUR. Because for me, what's most important is my country, is what Venezuelans are going through. So I do think that we have a responsibility to help all of those Venezuelans who are going through a situation, through the dire situation of misery that the country is going through right now. And in that sense, no, I completely disagree with the imposition of any type of economic sanctions that would make Venezuelans' life worse right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This we've already gone a half hour over. I'm sure we'll talk about this the rest of the afternoon and skip one, but I think that'll be good. So, thank you very much to our participants. Thank you,
Oh, come on. You see like that, John? When you stay in the economy, I know.